good evening, everyone. This is Voto Latino's 9th annual Our Voices. We weren't sure if this was actually an appropriate time to have this because of what is currently happening. And we had a really honest conversation with each other. If we are getting off the heels of the most divisive election in this country, where a lot of it was who is and isn't American, it's more important to have this conversation in the back of the White House to remind folks that it's stories that mobilize, shape, that move agendas forward, and that give voice to the experiences that we're having. So let me introduce Cenk from the Young Turks first. And I don't know if he needs an introduction. Cenk is the #1 news site on YouTube, and he is the one shaking up that revolution. Cenk, thanks for joining us. Next, I'd also like to introduce Maria Cardona, political commentator for CNN, a fierce Latina on the airwaves, speaking truth to power. I'd love to introduce Jonathan Capehart, a friend. I admire him greatly, and someone who I have recently met, but I have admired her ascension and her grit and being able to manage it all, so we have to talk that offline, is Rashida Jones. She is Senior Vice President of Special Projects of NBC, and you're going to hear much more of her. So thank you so much for joining us.
All right, we're going to kick off the proceedings with me talking. We live in interesting times, and so sometimes our perspectives are actually challenged. So this might not have happened in the past, but it's certainly happening today. So I'm of interesting ethnicity, right? I'm Turkish, and so it doesn't really fit a lot of the boxes here in America. There's like 2 other Turks in the country. It's like me and Dr. Oz, that's it. So I'm not quite sure where I fit in. A lot of people are not sure where I fit in, but since the ascent of Trump, it's become very clear. This hadn't happened before, and I've been in media for over 20 years. But all of a sudden, the right wing has decided that I am very, very brown, and so it's. Thank you. So, and of course, they say that derisively, like, "Ha ha, you're brown," and I say, "Ha ha, you're correct." And right. But it does affect some things. Now, I do perspective and opinion anyway, so I'm not overly bothered by it. But they'll say, hey, you were born into a Muslim family, so of course you're going to support the Muslims, so it doesn't count, right? And so that's an interesting thing, and I wonder what your guys' perspective is, because this is a time where we need diverse perspectives more than any other time in media. But at the same time, there's pushback on, well, then are you biased because you come from a diverse background, and here is the President of the United States attacking some of those backgrounds. So is that an issue that's come up for you guys at all? Let me start here and walk us through it.
Well, the answer is certainly yes. And what I have seen most of all from the past 1.5 to 2 years of the most divisive election we've seen in a generation is that, for example, whenever I'm on TV, right, I get 2 things. Obviously from my supporters, I get, you go girl, you're fighting the fight, et cetera, which I love. And then from the critics, they say exactly what you just said. It's like, oh, well, you're a Latina and you're bringing up Latino racism and you're bringing up all these issues, kind of doing the same thing that Trump tried to do during the election, which is flip it all on its head. They're calling me a racist. They're calling, they're saying that I'm the one who's trying to inject racism into the conversation. So you really have to take that into consideration. You always have to check your own biases, but at the same time, it's more important than ever that our viewpoints actually get out there and get talked about. And I'll bring up one other example, and then I'll give it over to others. I'm on these panels, and most of the time I'm the only Latina. And I was in this conversation with an older gentleman who was a Trump supporter, and he's talking about how politics and culture is blind to race. And I turned and I looked at him, And I said, what society do you live in? Yes, if we lived in utopia, absolutely it would be that way. But how many times have someone walked up to you to say you should be deported? How many times has anyone walked up to you to say that your kids are anchor babies because you were not born in this country? I bet you zero. So that is why this kind of conversation with these kinds of diverse voices, everyone who's here in the audience and every other community, needs to be included in these national conversations.
So I am going to come at this, excuse me, from a different way. And the story I'm going to tell is not from the Trump era, but from maybe a year ago, 2 years ago. I can't remember now. So we all lived through all the videos of unarmed African Americans, mostly men, being shot down by police. And I wrote one piece after another. And unlike Maria, I'm an opinion writer. I love it when people say, you're biased, and I write back, you're right. I'm an opinion writer. My job is to give my opinion. And so I went way out there writing piece after piece after piece, decrying what was happening. And when Michael Brown happened, I was sub-anchoring for Melissa Harris Perry at the time. And just before I went to bed, I saw a hashtag Ferguson, and hashtag Michael Brown. And so I go online, I look at it, I am so angered, moved, horrified by it that I couldn't get to sleep, and I drafted a piece that was the opening monologue for the show, where I was full on, this is horrendous, this is horrible, we gotta get down to the bottom of this. I wrote piece after piece after piece, talking about how horrible all of this was. Fast forward, and everyone called for the Justice Department to come in, investigate, find out what happened. So the Justice Department, Eric Holder's Justice Department, President Obama's Justice Department came out with 2 reports. One about the Ferguson Police Department, which revealed that Ferguson, Missouri in 2015, 2016 was really Ferguson, Missouri in 1952, the way the police department in the city was financing itself on the backs of the poor and primarily African Americans. But there was a second report about the shooting of Michael Brown. Everybody in the media focused on the first report because that was the easier story to do. And I remember being on and not being asked the question about the second report. And as someone who, yes, I'm an opinion writer, and I tell you exactly what I think, that doesn't mean I don't do my own reporting. That doesn't mean I report facts or write about facts. So something said to me, you know what? If you're going to be true to what you're doing, what you're writing, you have to write, you have to read the report about the shooting of Michael Brown. And that's what then led me, after reading that report, it sent a shiver through my spine because the Justice Department revealed to me that everything that I had written specifically about the shooting of Michael Brown was wrong. And so now I was faced with a dilemma as a journalist, first and foremost, but also as a journalist of color, an African American man in a very rare spot in journalism who's put himself on the line with my own credibility under my own name. Do I ignore this? Or do I write about it? And I would hope that in newsrooms across the country, and especially if there are journalists of color in the room, that when you are faced with this dilemma, I would hope that you'd pick the route that I chose, which was, here's the evidence. Here's what the Justice Department says, not just what they say, but ballistics evidence, DNA evidence. And I spent a week writing this piece. And it was the hardest piece I have ever written in my entire career. Every sentence in this piece was considered because I just knew that African Americans and Democrats and liberals and progressives were going to come after me for what I had written. After spending the entire 2 years supporting me, saying, you go, Jonathan, you tell them, you're our voice, you're our person, and what ended up happening was, yes, that did indeed happen. Folks went after me like you wouldn't believe. Uncle Tom, Coon, all this other stuff. What I didn't anticipate, though, was that the right wing would embrace me all of a sudden, you're one of... Oh, no, it's already turned around.
Right.
But suddenly, I was one of the good ones. You're a real journalist. You, way to go for telling the truth.
Not fake news anymore.
No, but I tell, and I'm sorry for taking so long, but I tell that story because it's one thing to decry the lack of diversity in newsrooms, the lack of people of color in places where they can have their voices heard and have influence. But at some point, journalists of color are going to face a situation where their credibility on an issue that's very, very important to the country is on the line. And if they want to be taken seriously and found credible the next time something like that happens, and that was my fear. I did not want anyone to come back and say, well, you didn't write about this, so why should we believe you about that? And so, so I find myself in a situation now where, yes, the right wing has turned on me, and that's more than fine. That is more than fine, but I feel like I'm on
conversation.
Well, right, but I feel like I'm on sturdier and stronger ground because I did what I did.
You said a couple of things that I think that are fundamental when it comes to representing voices and really even challenging perhaps places where your support system, your community is actually saying, well, why would you report this? And you're like, it's because at the end of the day, the work is about credibility, about giving authenticity, about making sure that we are being true to the endeavor of not only truth, but helping people navigate the state that we're in. And as we look forward, I'm sure everyone's getting inundated with different stories. I actually keep joking that the Trump administration promised a jobs program, and he's doing that for media, because I don't think we've ever been so busy. But what are the stories that you may have said, shoot, we missed that?
I think for us, it was just a deeper dive into what was happening in communities that did not live on a coast. And so, one of the takeaways from 2016 was the data was correct to an extent, but the analysis was wrong. And how we looked at how people in different communities beyond the coast, beyond New York and LA, I think to an extent failed us. And part of it was having to take what the audience, what the voters, how the voters felt, and trying to process that in a way that we really hadn't had to process in elections past and years past. This was the first year we were faced with that in a way where what the data said and what people actually meant didn't necessarily live in the same plane. And so, in retrospect, that was something that no one could have anticipated, no one could have predicted. And I think looking ahead, we now have a better idea that what you see initially may not necessarily be what how people feel below the layer, and it requires us as journalists to dig a little deeper beyond the what does this mean, what does the data say, but really digging into, okay, what does this actually mean? When someone says they feel this way about this issue, what does that actually mean, and how does that translate into a vote is something that we're just faced with having to deal with in a very different way than we've ever had to before.
So let me ask a kind of a curveball question here, going off of that one, which is, should we be thinking about diversity in a different way? So we think about it in ethnic terms, of course, quite often, but I read a really interesting article that said that maybe we should have diversity in education. I was like, They said maybe some of the reporters shouldn't, what if they didn't have a college education? Well, that certainly would be a different perspective, right? On the other hand, can you hire someone who doesn't have a college education to be a reporter? But if we had, would we have seen the Trump phenomenon coming earlier? Because that was a huge part of his base. People with less college education obviously voted for him more than almost any other demographic other than white evangelicals.
Sure. So I think with that example, in my opinion, what we do is a responsibility. It's a responsibility that you earn. And I think there are lots of different types of media out there. There are some media where not having kind of a traditional education works. There are the Vices and the BuzzFeeds of the world where that makes sense and you bring that kind of sensibility. and that perspective. There are also types of media and types of journalism where it's required to have years of study, years of education, years of experience to be able to deliver to the mass public. Because at the end of the day, it's a earned opportunity to communicate to the masses in that way. And I think there are certain platforms and certain types of media where you need that kind of education, you need that kind of experience to be able to effectively and responsibly report as a journalist.
I also think that you don't necessarily have to have a journalist who didn't go to college to have the kind of upbringing that a lot of the folks Trump supporters have, right? I mean, there are plenty of people, even in this room, that grew up with nothing and that made it because of their own blood, sweat, and tears, opportunities. Their parents, made sacrifices, all of that. And they know and they remember what it was to have that upbringing. And I think that is a kind of diversity, certainly, that we would need.
I hear you, but can I just say real quick that, but a lot of the Trump voters didn't make it. And so that's kind of an uncomfortable truth, but we come at it from a perspective of the bubble, which is relatively successful. And so maybe it's harder to understand where they came from because they didn't make it.
But I would drill down, because I think that we keep saying that the folks on the coast are in a bubble, and I would actually argue that perhaps the folks that are in the bubble who don't see how interconnected we are increasingly globally are the folks in these areas. And how do we actually bring them to the other side? I would also argue that because the campaigns were so focused and siloing groups, that they didn't taste and understand the temperature, for example, in Texas. In Texas, for the very first time, American Latino voters, who are the hardest ones to mobilize, were voting in record numbers because a wall was going to physically change their experience. But there was no appetite to cover that story. And so when we talk about this idea of diversity, how do we ensure that our stories aren't siloed? How do we ensure that it's a conversation of America that is changing, but that if we continue this idea of this, and I don't like to use, but this idea that this is for the African American community, we're going to just talk about Black Lives Matter. We're just going to talk about immigration for Latinos. We're just going to talk to women about choice. That is actually not who we are as a totality of a human being. So how do we ensure our stories have that depth?
I think to answer your question and to answer your question, it's not necessarily who's reporting the story, it's who we're hearing from. And I think it's a diversity of voices that you hear in the stories on the news. If I'm getting into communities that are in Middle America and in these areas that may be exposed to different lifestyles, different points of view than kind of the traditional reporter, if I'm hearing from actual, as you said, Texas Latinos who don't only have one beat and one story to talk about, that's going to be much more effective than the person standing in front of the camera, in front of the mic, telling you that story. So I think the fix here is more people stories, getting into more communities. In the intro, you talked a lot about localization. It's being more local, more on the ground, more in the communities. That's where the stories are happening. That's where the news is happening. That's where the people are articulating their point of view. I think it's more of that, and that's how you get kind of the sentiment of the country.
And if I could add on top of that, one, can we just, Cenk, the way you're talking about this, it's as if every journalist who works in a newsroom on the East Coast or the West Coast makes a upper six-figure income and is living some grand life. Most reporters, like an overwhelming majority of reporters, don't make a lot of money. People go into journalism because they care about fill-in-the-blank issue, and this is their way of doing public service. So I always get my back up when I hear people talk about those of us in the bubble and we're out of touch, when most reporters are on the ground and living the lives of the people.
They're broke.
And broke.
Fair.
And the other thing, there's a panel that Third Way did earlier this week talking about demographics in the last election. And one of the people on the panel had this great analogy about what was the difference between Democrats and Republicans in elections. And she said, Republicans act as if elections are a closing argument in a trial. They are talking to the entire jury, meaning the nation, like, this is why you should vote for us, this is what we stand for. Whereas Democrats talk to each individual member of the jury. You're African American, here's what I have for you. You're a Latino, here's what I have for you. You're a woman, here's what I have for you. And I thought, that's exactly it. And so if you take that example in politics and put that into media, I think specifically national media needs to start looking at the country as not just white working class or African Americans, but what do all these folks have in common? What do they all care about? And then at the local level, drill down even deeper.
Well, I'd like to explore that, because I think that the more we start peeling back what happened in 2016, we are starting to increasingly discover that it's more along generational lines. That you actually have a cohort of young millennials that if you were just to just basically take a temperature just on their vote, only 5 states would have turned red. For the very first time, young white men did not vote for the Republican. They voted for a left of center, more left of center than the Democratic nominee. So how are we ensuring that we are capturing those experiences? Because it makes complete sense why the majority of white Americans are 56 years old. So it makes complete sense why a 56-year-old woman was not completely turned on by choice if she has lost her home, her husband is not sure if he's going to get retrained in this new economy, and her millennial son works at home, right? Is still at home. Yet that was all we were offering. So how do we tell that story that you're saying is that is inclusive? And what is the responsibility of having people in front of the cameras, but also making executive decisions, such as your role, to ensure that we're having that authentic conversation, that we're not actually buying into the narratives of either political party, but actually being tough, saying, we're living an interesting moment.
Can I just jump in for a second on that? Because I think the management part of that is really interesting, and I have a thought on that too in a sec. But on the issue of the millennials, it's a really fascinating topic. And that's in our wheelhouse, because our audience is literally 30 years younger than cable news audience. So 70%.
So are you too, Cenk, right? You're also 30 years younger than...
Not so much anymore. So anyway, 70% of our audience is 18 to 34-year-olds, and that gives 2 interesting perspectives. They're so much more progressive than the rest of the country that actually being quote-unquote balanced in the way that we would traditionally think in media, nonpartisan, et cetera, comes off as outside the mainstream to them. They're like, why would you represent a weird right-wing position? That's such a foreign concept. But like, we're supposed to discuss whether gay people should have the same rights as straight people? What are you, a maniac? Why would we discuss that, right? So it's we have to think about age diversity, because millennials do not share the same perspectives as the rest of the age groups. And then the second thing is they are so, and I'm going to be a little too optimistic here, and I know, of course, there's giant exceptions to this, but overall, there's so much less racist, sexist, and anti-gay rights that they find the discussion slightly weird. They're like, because a lot of them in their experience, they're like, what do you mean? Why do you keep talking about like these watershed moments for gay people when, of course, gay people are the same as straight people? Why are we having this conversation?
Well, and they grew up in that, right? And Generation Z is more than likely going to do that more. So how do we meet those 2 opposition generations in the newsroom that appeals to the older working class that says my country is shifting underneath me, and the other one is saying, well, you're not serving the stories that reflect me? Like that, I mean, those are tough decisions. How do you do that?
I mean, I think a lot of it goes back to this idea of, it's not us telling the public how people think and what they feel, it's the people. And so really being diligent in turning the camera around to the people that are affected by all of this. And I think the other piece of it, to answer kind of the how do you manage it question, I kind of look at the difference between perspective and bias. And in any conversation that you have when you're making editorial decisions, you can have a bias about certain topics, you can feel a certain way about certain things, but every single person that's a part of that editorial decision making has a certain perspective. And one of the things that's always been important to me anywhere that I've worked is the priority that they place on having different perspectives at the table making the decisions. And if you don't have people with different perspectives at the table making decisions, you get one viewpoint, one type of person, one type of thinking, And part of the responsibility is, as a journalist, is understanding the difference between perspective and bias. And I may feel a certain way about certain issues. I'm an American like everyone else. But it's my job to bring the perspective of someone who has lived my life, my point of view, my life experiences to the table in a way that's not biased, but that brings those perspectives to the table that other people may not have experienced or other people may not be thinking about. And I think that's kind of that magic sauce of how do you get into those other communities? If everyone at the table looks the same, if everyone at the table thinks the same, had the same upbringing, the same perspectives, the same ideas, you're not going to get that.
Well, that brings up certainly the viewpoint of the first wise Latina who's now on the Supreme Court, who talked exactly about that, right? That somebody with a different perspective and a different upbringing is going to open up pretty much a different world of how to view issues that is healthy for the country and that is needed. And so I think that's absolutely one thing that is needed in the newsroom. But I think the other thing is sometimes we are so immersed in our own issues that we innately talk about it only in one way. And I'll bring up an example, which is immigration, right? Immigration near and dear to the hearts of Latinos. And I talk about this even to my dearest friends who are in the advocacy world, where they, I think to an extent that is too much, focus on the sort of heartbreaking, pulling families apart, which of course is something that is going to move us. But I gotta tell you, to people who don't know immigrants and who actually think that immigrants could be dangerous to the world, they don't care about that. In fact, they might even celebrate it. So what do? Let's talk about immigration in a way that brings other people in. Let's talk about the economic impact of immigration. Let's talk about the national security impact of immigration. That way you're expanding the pool of people through which this is going to be an issue that perhaps they're going to find it more impactful to them.
And so on that note, what I do want to recognize that a lot of the folks that are in this room are starting their careers in news media. They are trying to figure out how to break into news media. What is your advice to them? What is their takeaway of how do you actually position yourself so that you are seen through the totality of your experience so that they can be next Jonathan Capehart, Maria Cardona, Cenk, and Rashida Jones?
It's one of my favorite topics, actually. Not being the next Rashida Jones. If I had to pick one thing, and I have lots of opinions about, what the right road is, but I think it's networking. I think it's making the connections, putting in the work, being persistent, looking for opportunities, finding opportunities to contribute where no one's asking you to do so, getting your foot in the door. It is far easier to get your first opportunity, your first job, your first foot in the door if you know someone. And knowing someone is as simple as handing out your business card here and taking our business cards and following up with an email and being persistent about what you can bring to the table and willing to do it for free, off hours, come in and shadow, make the connection, holidays, like those are the stories, those are the situations that can help propel you to the next level. But making that first connection and knowing someone, making the case as to why you are valuable, why your success in this industry, in this world, is valuable to the greater, media landscape. Put in that fight. And that's how you get there.
I would add two things. One, I agree with everything that Rashida said. I would also say, people come to me and say, I really want to write, and I really want to break in. And I tell them, compared to when I got into the business, there's so many ways to write and get your voice out there. So just write.
Do it.
And you could then send your stuff and say, look, I haven't worked anywhere, meaning like a New York Times or a Washington Post or a journal or a magazine or anything like that. But here's my take on fill-in-the-blank news of the day. And if it is sharp, crisp, witty, comes at it from a different perspective, people will be like, oh, let's get this person in here. Let's talk to them. That's the one thing. The second thing is, to add on to what Rashida said, in terms of getting your foot in the door, When I was an intern at the Today Show 30 years ago this last summer.
Not true.
I want your secret.
Not possible.
Now he's just bragging, right? He's just like,
When you
It's
were
the
10.
light and the makeup from earlier today. But I always tell folks when they get internships, or even if they get that first job in the door, no job is menial. There's no such thing as a menial job in an organization that you actually want to work for. If you show that you are there early, stay late, sort the mail if they do that anymore, whatever they do now in newsrooms where they are unbelievably helpful and they are there, folks take notice.
Yeah.
And they give opportunities to people who look like they really want to work. And if you want to be in journalism, whether it's print, broadcast, digital, it's a labor of love. This is not about getting rich or becoming a star. Most people do not. Most people get into this business because they want their voices heard, and they want to help people, and they want to change things. And so that should be your motivating factor above all.
I would just emphasize what you brought up in terms of, even as difficult as it is to break into sort of the big known newsrooms, there has also been no other moment in time where it is easier and there are more opportunities to be creative, to be innovative. I mean, how many bloggers that actually are well known today started out because they just started writing, like you said, they just put up their blog. There are, and so you can do that. You can start your own blog. YouTubers, so maybe instead of just, pouring different kinds of slime on yourself and getting 24 million viewers for that, then maybe go report a cool, interesting story in an innovative way, right? So I think just be creative, think outside the box, and I think those are ways.
So let me just quickly double down on a couple of those. On the networking, several of the people here that work at the Young Turks just came up to me or someone else at the Young Turks, and they showed initiative, and we gave them a shot. We tried them, and it worked. And then Jordan Charton, our first reporter, came up to me after a speech I gave in New York, actually several different times. And I was like, this guy really is hungry. He wants it, right? And so don't underestimate that. I agree with Jonathan on take any job. When I first got started in TV, I got a good break, and I was an on-air host, but it was a pilot, and then it didn't get picked up, and I was already down in Miami. I was like, I don't care, I'll do anything. And they said, okay, we have a low-level sales job. You're not gonna do that? I was like, wrong, I am gonna do that. And I just got in the building, and I found a way to get on air and just work hard, prove yourself at every turn. And then finally, on doing it your own, I mean, we're a pretty good example of that. We started in my living room, and now, according to almost every ranking online, we're larger than CNN digitally. So it is definitely possible, and the way that media is going today, what you start today might be larger than these other networks quicker than you think. So go get them.
well, thank you on that. I don't think we could have anything more, but I want to thank our panelists. I think we ended up taking a little longer, but I think we have so much more to say. But thank you. I want to thank WeWorks as well, and I do also want to thank Jessica Reeves, Dennis Gonzalez, with the Voto Latino team, if they could stand up. This was literally for all of your work and your leadership. Thank you for putting it together. Anastasia, once again, thank you for WeWork. And Praveen, thank you for making it happen. And by the way, tune in tomorrow night on the Young Turks, where it's going to be, I can't say live streamed, but it's going to be shown, correct? I believe that was.
Yes,
Yeah, thank you.
everything's always on the Young Turks.